All right, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Podolsky, and on behalf of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for what is now the seventh in this series of webinars related to how we can view the COVID-19 pandemic through a social medicine lens and act accordingly. We've heard from anthropologists, historians, economists, frontline clinicians, and even clinician patients, focusing throughout the series on who gets sick, what meaning we ascribe to such illness, and to various forms of caregivers, and how we respond individually and collectively. Today, we're in for something a little different and quite unique. We're going to consider how we, working in the broad domains of medicine and public health, can and should communicate with the public in an era where, quote, science is just another opinion, unquote, and where truth and a rational approach to public health and medicine are seemingly contested, if not subordinated to political expediency on a nightly basis. How we tell stories and communicate to the public is a crucial component of how we respond to the shifting burden of disease, whether in the pre-COVID or post-COVID era. And today, we're truly fortunate to hear from one of the world's foremost medical storytellers, Dr. Neil Baer. Dr. Baer graduated from HMS and is now a lecturer in our Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, where, among many other things, he's developed a highly productive media and medicine intensive program whose graduates are already responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. In between, he did a few things you might have heard about, ranging from writing for and executive producing ER, serving as an executive producer and showrunner for Law & Order Special Victims Unit, and executive producing the third season of Designated Survivor, which I'm in the midst of binge watching. I could go on for most of the webinar, but suffice it to say that Dr. Baer has also received master's degrees from Harvard's Graduate School of Education and from its Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and Sociology, has received numerous awards related to his writing and ability to communicate compelling health messages, and was the Class Day speaker here at HMS in 2018. He'll be followed today by the 2003 HMS Class Day speaker, Paul Farmer, our department chair and erstwhile discussant throughout this series, before we finish with questions and answers, which you can submit anytime through the Q&A button on your screen. So let's start with Dr. Baer.
Thank you so much, Scott, for inviting me into the department as well. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I'm here today to speak to you about drawing on our work to tell stories that can make a difference in people's lives. I'm in a unique position as a pediatrician and storyteller to write television dramas that are informed by my interests and experiences. This year, on the third season of Designated Survivor, I told a cautionary tale about the dual uses of CRISPR, both as a nearly miraculous gene editing tool that appears to have cured a woman with sickle cell disease, and as a tool that can change human evolution by manipulating the human germline. What's more, CRISPR puts the ability to create unimaginable bioweapons in the hands of those seeking to do massive harm. While thinking today about the talk, I reflected on what it means to be infectious. We certainly toss that term around daily, though we don't really know yet what levels of COVID-19 virion constitute an infectious dose, what viral load means for COVID-19 in terms of morbidity and mortality, who is a viral shedder and who isn't, and why some people appear to be asymptomatic. We have ideas informed by the data we have to date, but we need more data not only to understand COVID-19 better, but to formulate treatments. Before I delve into COVID-19 and its effect on the way we tell and will tell stories about the pandemic, I want to explore this idea of infectious, about how I used it to reframe a public health story in a new way. I used infection to tell a story on Law & Order Special Victims Unit back in 2006. I was trying to make a connection between gun violence and infection, to fashion the argument in terms of a public health issue beyond the right to bear arms. Please take a look at this clip from SVU that articulates what was back then a new way of looking at gun violence.
Some of you might think that Nathan Phelps acted out of simple vengeance. Ted Carthage murdered his mother, so he murdered Ted Carthage. That is what the assistant district attorney will argue. She will tell you that anyone who kills out of retaliation should go to jail. I agree with her. But that is not what my client did. Did he hate Ted Carthage? Absolutely. Did he kill him? Yes. So if not out of retaliation, what made Nathan do it? This is a new study published in Science magazine. It found that people who have witnessed gun violence are twice as likely, sometimes 3 times as likely, to commit an act of violence themselves. Nathan witnessed Ted Carthage shoot his mother. And just as this study predicts, he reacted with violence. This study equates gun violence with an infectious disease. Anyone exposed to it is infected. Now, you may not agree or like this study. Gun manufacturers don't like it either. It goes against their mantra. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. But this study points to something that is almost unspeakable in today's gun culture, and that is that the blame for violence can be directly placed on the gun. Once you see someone squeeze the trigger, it's easier to do it yourself. Nathan saw his mother shot to death in front of him, and at that moment, he contracted the disease. It wasn't his choice any more than it is your choice to catch a cold after someone has sneezed on you. Violence is the disease. Guns are the virus. And we have an epidemic on our hands.
Note that I drew on a study published in Science that actually posited causality. But the story was first emotional, a little boy on trial. We captivated the audience with a story about this little boy exposed to gunfire and then marshaled the data. This is important for all of you too. Vaccines are on everyone's mind today, and we need to think hard about how we tell the story about them. If a journalist asked you to discuss the state of vaccines amidst this pandemic, would you immediately go to the data, or would you begin with a story that engages the viewer, listener, or reader? As data-driven as you all are, and must be, I invite you to read the work of Paul Slovic, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. Slovic has influenced a range of writers and academics, including the New York Times op-ed writer Nick Kristof and the Nobel Economics laureate Daniel Kahneman. Slovic has shown experimentally that we as humans are story-driven. We're not in general moved by data. Think of the tortoise suffering with a straw impacted in its nostril. That story of one, in this case a sea turtle, moved millions and led to legislation across the country banning plastic straws. But if I tell people that each year more than 8 million tons of plastic are dumped into the oceans, it barely registers. How does one conceive of 8 million tons? And what can one person do about it? Examples of stories changing legislation and people's awareness abound. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. Their story is epitomized still today by Anne Frank. We are drawn to her bravery and heroism. In medicine, think of the impact of the Tuskegee experiments. Once books and the play and film Miss Evers' Boys were released, folks became aware. Folks spoke out. And recently, we saw the impact of storytelling in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which raised the question through a best-selling nonfiction work and TV movie about who has the right to profit from a person's DNA. Slovic posits that we're wired evolutionarily to deal with the few, to protect those immediately around us, our families. Not only do we feel impotent to deal with all that plastic in the ocean, but he argues that we have difficulty conceiving of that amount. But when we see one suffering turtle or human being, we jump to action. Of course, all of you are laser focused on data because that is the very nature of your work. But for most people, your work sails over their heads. It's deeply complex. Recall last week when Dr. Fauci described initial results using remdesivir to treat COVID-19. Many friends of mine were confused. What is a p-value? They asked. What does statistical significance mean? Is it true or not true that remdesivir reduced mortality from 11% to 8%? Well, if it's not true, then why did he say it? You must find ways to communicate what you're doing that will resonate with the public and be clear. You must tell stories that draw on the data, but also engage. Here's how I did that in 2009, when we told the story of a mother who failed to vaccinate her child against measles. Her 5-year-old was in the park and infectious, though not yet showing signs of a rash. He came in contact with a child under a year old who contracted measles from him and died. And we don't vaccinate children under 1. The mother of the unvaccinated boy was put on trial for involuntary manslaughter. Those are the perks of writing for television. Please watch.
But you didn't think about how your choice would affect other children.
Sierra Walker isn't my child. I can't make choices for her.
But you did. You made a choice and now she's dead. Your actions are directly responsible for her death. If she hadn't contracted measles, she would still be alive.
Is there a question here, Your Honor?
Is there, Miss Cabot? Miss Stewart, what is your medical degree in?
I don't have one.
But you were making medical choices on behalf of your child.
Just because I don't have a degree doesn't mean I can't be an informed parent.
You chose your informed opinion over that of people who do in fact have a medical degree and understand the science behind vaccinations and recommend that all kids be vaccinated.
I know what's best for my child.
If you know what's best and the doctors are of a different opinion, then it stands to reason that they don't have your child's best interest at heart.
Their science is just another opinion.
Your opinion killed a little girl.
Your Honor.
I'm just trying to show that if Miss Stewart had vaccinated her child, Sierra Walker would be alive today.
I'm not sure that's true.
You're not.
That woman was a horrible mother. It was just a matter of time until something tragic happened.
You're the one on trial, Miss Stewart.
Exactly. And how fair is that? I'm the good mother. I make sure my child eats well, is taken care of. She buried her daughter in a shallow grave.
Yes. She buried the child that you murdered. But you didn't think about how your choice would affect other children.
Sierra Walker isn't my
Sorry.
child. I can't make choices for her.
But you
Get
did.
to see it again.
You made a choice and now she's dead. Your actions are directly responsible for her death. If she hadn't contracted measles, she would still be alive.
Is there a question here, Your Honor?
Is there, Miss Cabot? Miss Stewart, what is your medical degree in?
I don't have one.
But you were...
Let's see, here we go. I'm back. Okay.
All good, Neil.
Okay. Here we are. Sorry about that. I just know how to put it on. I don't know how to, that's kind of the secret of being a television writer. We depend on massive numbers of people to make the show and to make it look like it's real. So we titled that episode Selfish because I sought to raise this question. What is our responsibility to children and what is our responsibility to the community of children? Back then we were seeing the anti-vaxxer movement taking hold, and as a pediatrician I was deeply concerned about the consequences of parents choosing not to vaccinate their children because they heard or believed that it was either harmful, their immune systems couldn't take it, or that it would cause autism. Tragically, we've seen my concerns and yours become a reality with children again dying or acquiring severe disabilities because they weren't vaccinated. Finally, let me point out what is one of my favorite lines from any show we've done. Science is just another opinion. This vignette points out what we're facing today. A mounting move by the right to stop sheltering in place and social distancing because science is just another opinion. We must all fight this profound misunderstanding and fear of science and what we know experimentally to be true. Again, we see this theme reiterated, the right of the individual versus the community. But must it be versus? Isn't what's good for the community in the case of protecting against an invisible enemy like COVID-19 also good for oneself and for one's family? How can you as physicians, healthcare providers, and bioethicists all tell the story of what you do? And let me be clear, it's not just in the telling, it's in the doing. Think of the daily briefs by the president where we're admonished to shelter in place, wear masks whenever we're outside, and to maintain a distance from others of at least 6 feet. And yet daily, the president and doctors Birx and Fauci tell us a different story. Standing shoulder to shoulder, shaking hands, touching the same mic, they break the rules of safety they keep stressing. They're telling us a powerful story. Do as I say, not as we do. We're above all this. We're special. That profound mixed message resonates with some members of the audience. Well, it must not be that serious or they'd be practicing what they're preaching. Each day, that dissonance between the verbal and visual message is broadcast. What impact would it have on the audience if the president and his posse practiced what Governor Cuomo tells us and shows us? So how do you start to think about telling your story? Sometimes it helps to reflect on what personal event in your life brought you to this work. Was it a mentor, a story you read, a family member who succumbed to a disease that could have been prevented by a vaccine, or from one where a vaccine was not yet available? Telling your personal story moves the listener because they can empathize with you. And empathy is the gateway to changing hearts and minds. Now, I'm certainly not anti-data. I'm a physician after all, and I need data to give me direction to take in making a diagnosis and treating a disease. I take research and data and craft them into stories that give us insight into our characters' struggles, dreams, and fears. For instance, I read in a 2007 in a journal that some researchers at Harvard were speculating on what would happen if we took DNA evidence and, instead of looking for a 99% match in the system, set our sights lower, say 50%. Presumably, we might find relatives in the system, though the perpetrator might not be. SVU's character, Olivia Benson, swabbed her cheek and sent it into the system that keeps DNA on a variety of criminals, setting it to around 50%. She did this because she was looking for her father, who raped her mother and was never found. It turns out she got a match to her brother, who was in the system for burglary, and from him she learned the identity of her father. Jump to 23andMe and Ancestry.com and other DNA databanks that are routinely now finding biological siblings and parents, often disrupting the lives of those who are just looking for information on their ancestral background. We've even found serial killers like the Grim Sleeper in LA after a young man was arrested for burglary. His DNA was sent through at a lower set point and matched DNA at around 50% to a man in LA who lived near the killings. Detectives took that man's DNA from his trash, and lo and behold, it matched and he was caught. Interestingly, in that journal article I read in 2007, issues of privacy were raised back then, though the authors didn't conceive of millions of people voluntarily submitting their DNA to ancestry sites. How it's been used or will be used is certainly a question we must talk about as scientists and physicians. Where does privacy end and protecting the public's health begin? That's a question we keep coming back to. It's a question we think about and legislate about when it comes to requiring children to be immunized before attending school. Should a family's religious beliefs instilled upon their children allow families to forgo immunization and trust in herd immunity? What again about that family's responsibility to the community of children and families? What will COVID-19 teach us about sheltering to keep everyone safe? I keep coming back to the importance of telling emotionally riveting stories grounded in data to change people's hearts and minds and improve public health. You might be wondering, do these stories make a difference? I wondered that too. So in 2000, I designed a story about HPV and cervical cancer and conducted the first experiment to assess what our audience actually learned from our show. With support from the Kaiser Family Foundation, Princeton Survey Research questioned a random sample of around 1,200 ER viewers before and after the episode ran. The episode was the treatment, but we didn't tell viewers to watch it in order not to bias or contaminate the sample. Keep in mind that this episode aired before Gardasil, the vaccination to prevent HPV, was available in 2006. Okay, so I'm going to show you the several clips from that ER episode and then show you the results.
We heard you can't tell anybody anything we say to you.
Well, that depends on what you tell me.
It's about
Sex? Well, if there's no abuse involved and the guys are under 18, then everything you tell me has to remain confidential.
so you couldn't tell our parents.
No, I couldn't.
I promise.
Go ahead, what is it? Look, I can't help you if you don't tell me what it is.
We're afraid we might have caught something.
Well, what do you think you might have caught?
We heard some syphilis was going around school.
I see. Why don't you girls come with me, okay? Is Terry okay? She's fine. She's sitting over in chairs.
There's cervical bleeding and thick and white dysplasia with patches. Is that syphilis? Dysplasia? There's no sign of syphilis, but we have to wait for the blood test to be sure.
You can go ahead and get dressed.
So I can go? No, your HIV test won't take long. I'd like you to wait. Oh, am I all right?
Let's wait and see what the test says.
The other girl looks okay, but give pathology to do a stat pap smear on this one.
All right, let's get you dressed.
Oh, wait, we gotta go. Oh, bye. Sorry, we were just talking to some friends.
Terry, I need to talk to Andrea privately.
Is she all right?
Could you just go wait in chairs, please?
It's okay.
Thanks. Andrea, we got your test results. They found some abnormal cells in your pap smear. You might have cervical cancer. We need to do a biopsy just to make sure.
Cancer? Is it caused by having sex?
Well, you get it from an infected partner. It's called HPV, human papillomavirus. But not everybody with HPV
No, you
has
can't
cervical.
tell my parents.
Andrea, if you have this, you need to be admitted to the hospital.
Anyway, they're in Europe. You said everything I told you was confidential.
If you're not treated, you could get very sick. We also have to inform your partner. Andrea.
I don't know who it is. I mean, which one?
Well, how many have you had?
Not sure. Yeah, they have these parties.
I don't know. Both girls have been going to these sex parties at school friends' houses.
Oh my God, at their age?
I promised her I wouldn't tell her folks, and legally I can't.
Wait, she's a minor and she needs surgery.
Well, maybe I can talk her into letting her tell her parents.
Carol, I understand you don't want to break confidentiality, but this is a public health issue now. At least one of those boys is spreading HPV. And the girls at those parties all need to have pelvic exams and pap smears. So whatever she says, you also need to call the school.
Hey, Malik, have you seen a girl in a school uniform?
I saw two of them. They went out that door.
Damn it.
What are you doing here? You knocked us out, didn't you?
I need to talk to you.
Get away! You promised, you bitch!
You need to come back in.
You said there were rules, and you
I
couldn't
know
break
what
them.
I said, but I can't.
You lied to me, to both of
Look,
us.
it is a lot more complicated than that. Your health is in danger, and other girls could get infected too.
No, everyone's gonna know everything.
Andrea? Andrea!
So we published the results of our findings in the journal Health Affairs in 2000. I'll show you now through a PowerPoint what our findings were. As you saw just in those few clips, we reiterated the issue, the ethical dilemma over and over, the right of the individual versus the right of the community. There are kids who have HPV and they're spreading it, but Nurse Hathaway made a promise that it was confidential. We would have tracing, and she didn't get into that. We probably would talk, if we were to do this now, we would talk about this, I think, a little bit further, but we wanted to see what people learned from this sequence. So here we go. So among regular viewers of ER, the percent who said that they'd learned something important health-wise from the show is over 50%. Talked with friends or family about issues raised on the show, 50%.
You know, are you showing us the slide yet?
Yes, I am. Do you not see it?
No, I don't think it's been shared yet.
Let me share. Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Okay, and then here we go. There we go. Now you can see it.
Okay.
Great. So 53% learned health issues, 51% shared it with friends, a third got information that helped them make choices about their own health or their family's health. About a quarter had gone to other sources afterwards, and 14% actually talked to a doctor or other healthcare provider because of something they saw on the show in general on ER. And then now specifically to the show, percent of regular ER viewers who can correctly define HPV. So again, this was in 2000 before Gardasil. Only 9% could correctly define it. I hope now more can after the vaccine. A week after the episode, 28%, and then it dropped down to about half to 16%. But you know, ER is on Hulu now, which is great because it's being repeated. And you could combine it with other communication approaches to reinforce what was done on ER. And then the percent of regular ER viewers who know that HPV is associated with cervical cancer, and this really was profound. About 20% knew that it was associated with cervical cancer or caused cervical cancer, the main cause, and 60% learned after the show. And that dropped down to about 40%. But one has to have the information in order to make choices in one's health. So we were really pretty stunned to see this, and therefore decided, you know, we had already been doing this, but to try to make everything that we said as factual as possible, because people took what we were doing as the truth. All right, so now I'm going to show you a clip from ER. So this is where we, from SVU, this is where we decided to do an actual study and take action. So I met a young woman around 2007 or so who had been sexually assaulted and was afraid to leave her home. So it was a real story that inspired me because her rape kit, which takes 4 to 6 hours gathering DNA evidence from the victim, her rape kit was never opened. That her perp was most likely still on the streets, and she was afraid, understandably, to leave. And this really started me on a venture to figure out how often was this the case. And I was shocked to find out that it was over, I think, 400,000 untested kits. And this became Mariska Hargitay's main focus of her foundation, the Joyful Heart Foundation, in testifying before Congress. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how we took a story and then expanded it to have impact. So first, this is like a 30-second piece of from the episode. Here we go.
In Houston, they have a backlog of 4,000 rape kits. He says he'll get me the results when he has them. Birmingham, more than 2,000 rape kits. Phoenix has 4,100 untested rape kits.
We counted almost 7,000 kids. We think there might be as many as 16,000 kids here.
Have any of them been tested?
So far, only about 1,200.
I wonder how many guys like Harris could have been stopped if those rape kits had been tested.
Until they are, everyone is just a victim who'll never get justice.
It's like we're telling them that they don't matter, and we're telling the perps that they can get away with it. In Houston, they have a backlog of 4.
So we went to a number of places to share this story before it aired on Law and Order Special Victims Unit. So it was on the NBC website. And Mariska and I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post. And her foundation began to activate the Emmy last year on opening the backlog of rape kits. And we worked with other organizations like Take Part, which is part of Participant. We partnered with Nick Kristof, the op-ed writer of the New York Times, and you can see here that he had a little bit.ly. And if you clicked on his bit.ly, and he had, you know, he has hundreds of thousands of followers, you could see that little, what we call bubble tweet that I just showed. So it gave you information. So once you're inspired by this and you find out the story, then what do you do? And so we worked with Human Rights Watch because that was an issue that they were focusing on, and they designed a kit that we could give viewers to go to their chief of police or city council members to open the backlog of kits. Now, this is not a very controversial issue. It's really a question of political will and finance. So we understood that this was, a very important issue. It's a public health issue in terms of trauma and assault. And so we wanted to give people a way to do something, to actively engage and not just wonder what they could do. So bridging the gap between inspiration and action has been, a focus of my work over the years. And so then we showed them how to get their own kind of so-called kit so that they could use that to testify. And then we went to participant and take part. And then, we wanted to have an expansive audience. We wanted to expand our audience beyond the Venn diagram of Nick Kristof and Huffington Post. So we went to Good Housekeeping, US News, Ms. Blog, and all of these different ones. And we had huge numbers of hits with this just bubble tweet. Okay. So soon I hope we'll be telling news stories about COVID-19. And those stories must be as accurate as we can make them, given the knowledge we have today. Many people, I fear, expect science to be static, immutable facts that we can grab and hold on to. But science evolves as we learn more each day, particularly related to COVID-19. Uncertainty breeds panic, but holding on to pseudoscience because we are scared only leads to disaster, as the pandemic and our president have demonstrated on a daily basis. This year on Designated Survivor, we attempted to describe and talk about a pandemic. On our show, it was triggered by those who sought to use CRISPR gene editing technology for nefarious ends. So I'm just going to show you a brief, this is our last clip, from just a few months ago. And it's getting a lot of attention on Twitter. And people are asking us, well, I'll play it first and then I'll explain, or you'll probably understand why.
Diane got the Tampa Health Department to set us up with a lab. She's going to fly down to debrief us.
Still wish we could have driven. Planes are breeding grounds for disease.
This doomsday disease obsession you have can't be healthy. We do have antibiotics and vaccines.
A single cough spreads 500,000 virus particles. Put a coughing person on a plane with recycled air, it becomes an incubator. Infected passengers fly from San Francisco to London, maybe. Along the way, they infect others who are flying to Vancouver or Nairobi. And soon, the world is gripped by a plague from which we'll never recover.
We'll rent a car on the way back.
Thank you.
Diane got the Tampa Health Department to...
We'll rent a car on the way back. Well, that's one solution, but not a very viable one. So people asked us, how did we know that there would be a pandemic? And of course, the answer is because we all knew, those of us working in the fields of public health, we knew it was a matter of time after MERS and SARS. We knew that there were other viruses like SARS and MERS, spread through bats. We had all the data, but our stories just weren't getting out there. So now we have this opportunity to use the pandemic to tell stories in a new way. The pandemic has actually, I think, ripped the cover off the festering inequalities in this country and exposed the consequences. Who has access to masks? Who must work shoulder to shoulder in meatpacking factories, and who can work sheltered at home? How do we take advantage of the disparities COVID-19 is teaching us and make them into cogent stories? African-American adults are 60% more likely than non-Latino white adults to have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes by a physician. In 2016, African-Americans were 3.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with end-stage renal disease as compared to non-Latino whites. That puts them at higher risk for dying of COVID-19, which explains in part why their death rates are so much higher than those of other groups. We must tell that story of unequal access to healthcare. The data are there. Too many of us just haven't been paying attention. I wonder what a partnership between healthcare providers and patients would look like, where together they tell the story of COVID-19. That might be a new way to tell a powerful story, which I really haven't seen often portrayed. I see stories from the doctor's perspective or those from the patient's, but what would the story look like of a doctor and patient together relating their shared journey? What might it reveal about access or being understood? How can we draw on the plethora of storytelling modalities, poetry, blogs, op-eds, memoirs, iPhone videos, graphic novels, Instagram, playwriting, documentaries, virtual reality, dance, and music to tell what COVID has wrought. Recently, 17 of our students in a media and medicine course wrote a crowdsourced op-ed published in USA Today on access to ventilators. That may be one of the first crowdsourced op-eds ever published. But who says op-eds must be authored by 1, 2, or 3 people? The pandemic forced our students to tell stories in a fresh way, and they succeeded. Science is just another opinion, reveals much more than a disdain for science. It reveals a view that what I want and think is best is more important than what's best for the community. It disparages public health findings because that pushes up against what I want. My right to have a gun is more important than a child's right to not be shot in school. My right to go out into the community and go bowling or stroll on the beach is my freedom. But our interactions have consequences, as COVID-19 has shown over and over. We are indelibly connected, whether we like it or not. When we see those connections, when we see the consequences of our actions and stories, then we may take the template of our own lives and begin to examine our views in a new light. That is the power of storytelling. COVID-19 has offered us a reset button on the world, and we must come out swinging. Skies are blue in Los Angeles, Delhi, Nairobi, and Beijing. For the first time, many people around the world are breathing clean air. The pandemic has much to teach us, not only about COVID-19, but about how we may live in a new way, tackling problems that just months ago seemed almost insurmountable. Take obesity, for instance. As we all shelter in place, we must learn how to exercise and eat well without the pull of gyms and restaurants. We've had time to contemplate what is and is not important in our lives. Will drinking a Coke open happiness or make us feel better that we are now, as Coke says, alone together? Products like sugar-sweetened beverages that have been shown by a plethora of peer-reviewed studies to increase the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and mortality seem unnecessary now, and they don't make us happy, and Coke does not make us happier. Yet Coke alone employs almost 90,000 people, and that does not account for all the people who supply the ingredients, market it, and sell it around the world in stores, bodegas, and kiosks. That can be the difference in moving a mother in Southern Africa out of poverty. The pandemic has exposed the insidious link between employment and industries that harm our health and the disastrous effect it has on those people who must rely on sugar-sweetened beverages or on fossil fuels to eke out a living. We don't need Coke to survive the pandemic. In fact, we're much healthier without it. California is considering a 2-cent per ounce soda tax on sugar-sweetened beverages to offset the costs of the pandemic on the state. Is it smart? You bet. How do I know? Because data, again, lead the way in telling this story. Numbers of studies in peer-reviewed journals have shown that soda taxes can decrease consumption of soda, and that the best way to get a tax passed is not to harp on obesity and health issues, which many people perceive as finger wagging, but to talk about the social good it will do. Philadelphia has shown this by telling the story of the tax as a means to improve pre-K education. California should tell the story as a way to offset the costs of the pandemic to avoid the counter story promoted by the American Beverage Association that a tax is unpatriotic because it takes away consumer choice and imposes an anti-state. You see, it's always about the story and the counter story. And neuropsychology is teaching us a great deal about story impact, not to mention Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and Google. The pandemic has thrust us into a natural experiment in living differently, and we must take advantage of what it has boldly illustrated, not only about health disparities and access, but also about what we can do without. It also illustrates how we have succumbed to living a utilitarian life, one which parades the greatest good without deeply considering the long-term consequences. A good example here is vaccine challenge experiments, where volunteers who have given informed consent would offer themselves as test subjects to be infected with COVID-19. Arthur Kaplan and Stanley Plotkin argued recently in an article entitled "Extraordinary Diseases Require Extraordinary Solutions" that it is permissible to infect young volunteers who've given informed consent because, as they say numerous times, this is for emergency use. In other words, all bets are off in ordinary times. The authors go on to say that, quote, "Despite the danger, we believe it is ethical to ask now for volunteers who would be informed about the known and unknown risks." And they focus on 18 to 29-year-olds because of the Wuhan studies that showed that they were dying at the lowest percentage. Giving informed consent for unknown risks raises the fundamental question, can anyone truly be fully informed? When we're planning to infect volunteers for the greater good, we are essentially saying that what we do may kill them so that others may live. Finally, Kaplan and Slott can deal with the possibility of death. They say it's remote in young people, but do we know enough to say that? And they state the following. A challenge study would require controls who receive no vaccine and who might become ill. Possible rescue treatments are being tested, such as remdesivir, convalescent serum, and other modalities which could be used in case of a severe disease after challenge are administered as soon as virus positivity is confirmed. Unfortunately, these so-called rescue treatments have not rescued the tens of thousands of people who've perished already. I wouldn't call them rescue treatments at all, but treatments under investigation, and there's certainly no magic bullet. The point I'm making here is that we must be wary of using warlike metaphors to justify treatments for the greater good. Utilitarianism has the tendency to begin choosing whom to sacrifice for the greater good. How many deaths are acceptable as we venture out in order to save the economy? Shouldn't we also be asking, is the form of our economy worth saving, or can we boldly chart new models that will keep the air and rivers clean and move workers into new jobs? It's a monumental challenge, but we've seen the blue skies and breathed the clean air. The pandemic calls for new ways to tell stories that move people while revealing the terrible inequities that many people have learned to turn away from in their daily lives. We need to help people listen to the science. We need to make the data clear visually so that we tell cogent stories about the meaning, say, of contact tracing. How then can you do this? It's a Herculean task just to develop vaccines, and now I'm asking that you're prepared to tell stories as well. I do that because who best to tell these stories but the people on the front lines? You know the data. The challenge is to make it understandable to the public. One way to do this might be through cross-collaboration. We hear about this so much today as if it suddenly sprung forth for the first time. Clear need made it happen. That Tufts, BU, Harvard, MIT, and the Broad are all collaborating for mass CPR comes at a time of crisis. I hope we've learned that after COVID-19, collaboration can still work wonders and that economics doesn't elbow its way in to prevent it. Collaboration across disciplines might be one way to tell the story, not just with the medical school or the School of Public Health, but with all the schools, including the School of Education, the Kennedy School, the Divinity School, Arts and Sciences, all of the schools. New and traditional storytelling modalities exist to tell your stories, and I invite you to use them. We also need to collaborate beyond science to guide policy and program development. We can no longer live in silos. We must share our knowledge about the beyond the Longwood campus. Traditionally, you share and explore your ideas with your colleagues and through papers and conferences, but those aren't the only ways to communicate, and they leave out the general public. One group that could sorely use your insights are students in middle school and high school. Learning about the basics of public health will only help them understand and prevent future pandemics. Another way to begin on your storytelling journey post-COVID is to reflect on why you are here and what brought you to the work you're passionate about. Share that passion. I'd like to hear those stories. Inform me, infect me, and captivate me. Thanks for having me, and I think we'll do some discussion or questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that convincing illustration of both the impact and the importance of these stories. And certainly never has there been a time where we need such data-informed stories. So thank you very much for that roadmap to how we could all helping us moving forward. Now we'll get to hear from Dr. Farmer and his commentary.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Neil. If there was ever any argument, and I haven't heard one against it, that we should learn how to better communicate with the public, it certainly feels right now that this is no longer some subterranean groundswell, that it is of urgent importance. And indeed, it almost seems these days like we can see the impact of our efforts to alter communications in a way that is much more familiar to you than it would be to those who only use conventional academic mechanisms to convey their messages. So thank you for your long campaign. Just a couple of points, and then I want to go to a question. First of all, thank you for reminding us, and again, we're talking about 15 years ago, that more than communicable pathogens are infectious. your visuals and the stirring exchange about the contagiousness of gun violence is delightfully shocking to this day, Neil, and clear, and I just think about work, you said to infect us with your stories, and you've already heard Ann Becker's work around body morphology or body dysmorphia in Fiji, in which she really shows that television is a mechanism by which infectious notions of body image become disseminated among high school girls in Fiji. And again, a gripping story if ever there was one, and one that deserves, for lots of reasons now, a wider audience. I just wanted, before I turn to my question, I just want to notice that, one of the things that you're saying again and again about stories is we really need to re-socialize them. That stories, in spite of our romantic notions about them, are not immune to being stripped of social detail. And that even disciplines known for their re-socializing capacity, psychology would be a good example, so many forms of demography, sociology, etc., can be desocialized. Even anthropology can become desocialized. So the story and counter story is a really vital challenge for us, Neil, that we understand that we're not just trying to simplify or bowdlerize a message or a story or a new technology like CRISPR, but to uncover the stories and counter stories that are there and were there, if in nothing else than in the lives of those who are pursuing the research. It seems to me that by this sort of not a Bayesian framework, but a Bearsian framework, we could learn how to make a lot of stories that have really not been on the front burner in a broad public. We can make a lot of them much more compelling. I mean, indeed, my transition to this call was a little bit awkward because I was in the middle of, as I said, a call with Haiti. But in fact, it was a call between the head of the Pan American Health Organization, a group of Haitian physicians gathered on a border with DR, folks in Boston, in DC. It's a dramatic story packed into what sounded like a boring Zoom call. And we know that you can imagine the drama behind these stories, and I think we do as well. So here's my question, and it'll seem a little bit specific, but when you look back about 15 years at SARS and MERS, right, which were clearly, it's hard to imagine a more dramatic backdrop than the MERS story. You got camels, you got Saudi Arabia, you got international travel, you have a high case fatality rate, you've got other continents involved. What is it? What are some of the stories maybe that might have made a difference 15 years ago? Or is it merely that this had to happen, the pandemic that didn't happen with SARS and MERS, or Ebola for that matter, or Nipah, or right through the list? Would we have to see the kind of large-scale suffering and death, which is going to be ongoing and in waves? Would we have to see that before we seized on the right stories? Or can you look back and say, here's what we could have done to make this MERS story as vibrant as it should have been and as much of a warning as it should have been?
I think that's a great question. And, Slovik talks a lot about that. How do we make it relatable when it happens to someone else? And I think about COVID as, I talked a little bit about the uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds panic, but it also captivates. So we're faced with the uncertainty. It's almost like a detective story or a thriller. We're sitting on the edge of our seats waiting for the next plot point to drop. And it captivates us because it involves us. And yet, 1,200 children die every day from malaria. And there's no panic because, one, we know how to treat it. Two, we know how to prevent it. And three, we know what causes it. We don't do a very good job of preventing it because it's over there. But it's a massive number of children dying every day. and it doesn't receive the media attention that COVID does, for obvious reasons, not good reasons, but for obvious reasons, that it's not happening here. If malaria were happening here, then we would hear a lot about it and we would be, fighting the fight, though there are many people around the world and at Harvard who are doing research on malaria vaccines. So the challenge is how do you construct a story that resonates? Like the story of the turtle, or the story of the one child, the little girl from Syria who washed up on a beach, a horrible story, but that compelled people because it was the story of one, and people can relate to one. Slovak wrote a piece called "Why We Don't Pay Attention to Genocide," and it's kind of the same answer that I'll give. Why don't we pay attention to pandemics? Because there are lots of numbers, there are lots of people we don't know, and maybe we're wired in some ways for the few, but I guess what I would say is to try to tell, and because of streaming on television, we're a much more global world, despite what our president would like to think. And we can get television from all over the world now through Netflix and other streaming platforms. And those countries get ours as well. So we're very connected. And I think seeing those stories, really making compelling stories about the one, has shown experimentally to have impact. And so I think we have to look to those kinds of stories and present them through the media, through journalists, and through our own work as healthcare providers. The other thing I'll say is that we've always been at a disadvantage, Paul, because we're fighting the anecdote. So when Lancet published, I should say mispublished, the data on autism and vaccines and then retracted it, and the author lost his license, his medical license over it, because he had made up the data and it was shown not to be true, that had a huge impact. And we always have the anecdote of a parent coming to us and saying their child was well and then not well afterwards. And we have to have, our hearts open to them, but they're not going with the science. And this is what's really tricky, is because they have an anecdote. There's always an anecdote. And we as healthcare providers have the data. So how do we provide the anecdote as well that is evidence-based, so that we're prepared when we're going in to give a talk about, a good example would be prostate cancer. There's a lot of debate about how to treat it, how to even test for it, but there always will be an anecdote of someone who was young who got a PSA test and said, it saved my life. And so we have to be ready, not only with the data, but with stories that can move and say, yes, well, this is what it means. And that's really hard work. And that's going to take some thinking, but I think that will help us in many ways to counter these anecdotal stories or the fake medical stories. Someone just sent me one yesterday that said, that someone who worked for Fauci said that there were vaccine cover-ups, and it turned out that that person is sort of a known anti-vaxxer. So we have to be aware of who's giving us the information. Let me tell you another really interesting story, because it raises some really profound issues. There were two emergency physicians in California who did a study, and they did a press conference in their scrubs, and they opened, and I got very nervous from their opening when they touted that they'd taken a lot of courses in biology and chemistry and biochemistry. And they did a study, and their point is that we've miscalculated the number of people who are infected, and it's such a high number that it's pushed the death rate much lower than what we would expect. And the ACEPs, the American College of Emergency Physicians, went ballistic and said, first of all, they're not epidemiologists. This is not a controlled study. And apparently they had some investments in clinics that were not open. So they went on Fox News and touted their findings. YouTube took them off, and people said this is a question of free speech. So here's where we're just seeing it, boiling up. And is it a question of free speech when people who are physicians present a study that is not done under the standards that we all accept as scientifically valid and accurate, and promote ideas that just have no basis in science. And YouTube, I believe, rightfully took them down. It's not an issue of free speech when it can harm people's health. And, you know, this is a big issue for Facebook and, you know, free speech versus the right, you know, to not have misinformation. And on top of that, because they have so much data on us, they know how to target, and through, you know, profound movements by neurobiology and neuropsychology, we know how to tell stories, or certain people know how to tell stories in ways that speak to our experience. So we're up against a lot of tough times. We're up against the science, really, because there are people using the science, using the algorithms, using our data to tell stories for their own political ends, which are not consonant with, you know, public health ends. So these are big challenges, but what more can we do than speak about it, and speak using whatever storytelling modalities we most feel comfortable with.
Terrific. Scott?
Great. Thank you, Paul, including for coining the neologism Bayesian. We've had several excellent questions, and some you've already have covered, and some are around this notion of that in this changing, whether we call it media landscape or informational ecosystem, where circulation of information on social media, YouTube, Twitter, is very different, certainly from the media that I grew up with, which is watching your shows. How does the shift where we should be placing our stories, and how should we be placing our stories?
I think that we have to use every modality that, you know, everyone else has available. So, you know, it is the story counter story world we live in. And so we shouldn't limit ourselves to op-eds. They're really important, and they get picked up by policymakers, certainly. So we want to publish in the New York Times and Stat and Washington Post op-eds about these issues. But we also want to publish in places where the general public goes. And so we need to work, you know, that's why I talked about cross collaboration. So for instance, at Harvard, I don't know that there's really any cross collaboration between the Department of Visual Environmental Studies, which makes students, undergrads make documentaries, and a new program in media, theater, and dance. And so we need to take advantage of collaboration, and you know, poets and those who teach poetry, you know, in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, to bolster our ability to tell stories. I was talking to Dan Baruch recently, who runs the vaccine lab that's looking at COVID and also still HIV. And it just occurred to me in talking to him that we need to place our students from our intensive, for instance, into labs at HMS to help them tell their story, because that's not what they've been trained to do. And so we're thinking, we're trying to think in fresh ways. How do we collaborate to get the stories out beyond the traditional modes, which we still need, of the Harvard Gazette or Harvard Publishing, which is really helpful, where Harvard faculty have been cited in the day's media. We need to think of, you know, like my students did. I never would have thought of crowdsourcing an op-ed. And they did it. And you know, they went, one person started it, and then they went around and they wordsmithed it, and they got into Zoom groups, and they talked through it, and lo and behold, they published it right away. And so I think that the good that comes out of the pandemic, out of this, you know, in light of all the tragedy, is that it's forcing us to be creative in new ways, not only in the way we teach. I just taught a course at the Kennedy School, and you know, I had 13 students from all over the world, and we had to figure out when to do it and how. But it pushes us to be creative in new ways, and not to, you know, just accept the old version of the way things are done. And I think, you know, I could even think in terms of, for instance, a journal article that we could have office hours with the people who wrote an article per se, like take Kaplan and Slotkin. It'd be really interesting if they had office hours and we could go in and have a conversation with them and we could discuss their findings as opposed to the old version, which is you can write a response and it'll be published months later and then a counter response much later. And I learned this from doing television with Twitter, particularly with SVU when Twitter started to come forth. And I saw that TV was no longer a unidirectional medium. I would give on ER the material, the show, and the audience consumed it, but there was no interaction between us. Though we did have a project called Following ER, where we gave Johns Hopkins and the NBC affiliate a topic that was in that episode, say breast cancer awareness or kidney transplantation, and then they would do a news piece on it. And that was the only way I really had to follow up on the story of ER and get it out there. Now, with social media, I can watch a show while people are watching it. I see their tweets. I can tweet back to them. It's a multi-directional world now that we're taking advantage of. And so, we can also get lost and go down the rabbit hole of Twitter. And so we have to, figure out where our time is best spent. But it's also about where one's passions lie in terms of using a medium and getting trained. And also, at Harvard at the Bach Center, the Derek Bach Center, they train students and they train faculty. I believe Lisa New, who's a professor of English, really works on this, doing poetry and health with Rafael Campo, a physician at HMS. And they train people to use media and editing and iPhones and iPhone cameras and how to make short docs. So there are resources available to support and help one work on one's skills if that's where one feels like one wants to put their time. So there's a lot at Harvard that's kind of like just sort of there, but people don't know about it. And we have to make that more available particularly to people in public health now, because we're seeing the need for, just in the way that Dr. Fauci talked about remdesivir was problematic, because he is a renowned physician and researcher, and he spoke about it in terms that really, I think, confused people. And he had to do it on the spot, so I'm not castigating him for it, but we need to think about how do we talk about p-values and what's significant so that people don't just run to their physician and ask for remdesivir, which they're not going to get anyway because it's an IV drug. I mean, it's just, we just have so much to work on. But I think if we have the mindset that we have to explain things in ways that are clear to the public, as opposed to our students or our faculty, that's helpful too, that we have to really break it down. And I think the New York Times does that well with data visualization, which is really important. How do you show, what's the best way to talk about contact tracing? Is it just to chat about it? Or is it to show visually with one person, as in my little clip from Designated Survivor, and one person coughs, and visually you can imagine what that means. And then visually where they go off to Vancouver or Hong Kong or wherever, or Nairobi, and what does that mean? And that's exactly what happened with COVID, and we've seen it. And I think that we have to really work with the data visual people and visualization people, and they exist at Harvard, led by Francesca Dominici at the School of Public Health. And she's involved in the university-wide program in data visualization. So we got to pull people together now with, after we're able to really work together again and draw on the work that Dr. Dominici is doing with people in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences as well, to figure out it's not just a talking story, it's a visual story as well.
Thank you for that, and for pointing out all these local resources and this need for collaboration. I think we'll have time for one more question. This is for a different angle. The person said that when reading the news, there's a sense of weariness or a sense of information overload at this point, and they simply want to go on with their lives. And I guess there's a temporality to storytelling and a sense of the timing of what story to tell when. And does that come into your consideration as you're constructing stories, and when to deliver them and how to deliver them?
Yes. So a good example would be when we did rape on college campuses and rape in the military on SVU, I could not get anybody in the media interested in it. And it took years until Kirby Dick, a documentary filmmaker, made the documentaries, The Invisible War and his other documentary on those topics. And it was like suddenly it was in the news. And it's an accrual. So I've learned that it's an accrual of stories. And maybe my story doesn't have, notable impact. But then I think about the HPV story, and I don't know who watched the show, but it changed their knowledge base about HPV and cervical cancer. And I don't know, I know from the data that they told some people about it, likely 50% did. And so it spreads, and stories spread, and they accrue. And when they hit whatever that tipping point is, then they become writ large. And so I think we have that. So the lesson I've learned is not to be discouraged in talking about, like I did a show on Designated Survivor this year. I did a storyline about what it means to be undetectable with HIV. And I just really did not get much media attention for it. It was almost like people thought they knew about it, but then they really didn't. They had lots of ideas about what that meant, but there were a lot of people, even in our writer's room, who didn't know that if you're undetectable, there's not been a case of transmission. So we just went forward and did it. And I imagine that there'll be other stories. And, there are lots of people concerned about this issue. There are lots of people telling stories about this issue, and it will reach a tipping point. In terms of COVID, it's different in the sense that we're in this emergency, uncertainty, very, as Paul was pointing out, versus SARS and MERS, heightened state. And so there's going to naturally be fatigue, as I even showed in the data from the HPV. They see the show, they don't know about it. 9% know that HPV causes cervical cancer. A week after the show airs, 60% knows. And then it drops down to, I think it was 38%. That's the fatigue. People forget. And that's why we have to keep telling the stories. And we have to have, if we're doing something that's very focused, say on sugar sweetened beverages, we need a multi-pronged approach, not just one way to do it, but a multiple number of ways to tell the stories. And I think, though, that it's comforting that each of our stories do make a difference, because I saw that with ER, and I have no idea who saw it, who talked to someone else, who talked to a healthcare provider. So if someone reads your blog or your op-ed, I discuss op-eds all the time with friends and family and colleagues that, it spreads. It is viral. And so I think we can't be dissuaded or feel that, our contribution is, too small, because I just think that stories, are what resonate for people. And if we can click, like the sea turtle with the straw, that resonated. And sometimes we just can't predict what will, but that's not a reason not to keep going, because you just don't know. And it's very hard to measure. It's like the virus. It's like it goes out there and it spreads. And just like the virus, it reaches a tipping point, it reaches herd immunity. After enough people have been infected, we need to infect people with our stories.
Paul, did you have any final comments?
No, but that was a valiant dismount there, Neil. that was downright poetic.
Yeah. Great. Well, I just got communicated with a one-time revolutionary technology, and now somewhat of a dinosaur. But so we're gonna have to end this. That was that's just fantastic, and thank you so much for informing all of us, and obviously Paul.
Oh, thank you. And really, we have to figure out maybe through global health and social medicine how to link people, because there's so many people doing things at HMS and outside of HMS. the School of Public Health, and then beyond Longwood, making films and teaching students how to make films and teaching people how to edit and doing this work that, wouldn't it be amazing if we did a post-pandemic university-wide project of storytelling where we got economists and as this is going back to now Paul, anthropologists, sociologists, we convened thought leaders of the university and talked about how do we tell stories from all your perspectives? How do we engage you all? How do we draw on what works for you? It would be profound because everybody has their own lens through which they tell the stories. An anthropologist, a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, an epidemiologist, and we need everybody. And I think we're so fortunate that we have the resources in students and faculty to do some really amazing work on post-COVID storytelling so that when the next pandemic occurs, be it through CRISPR, which worries me, or through another coronavirus, we're more prepared.
Thank you. And Neil, thank you as ever for your endless generosity of being willing to do a curbside consult on a story.
Sure.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Great. For Neil and for our audience, thanks again for joining us. Next week, we'll have Vikram Patel will be leading our own dear Vikram will be leading a panel on COVID-19 in India, which should likewise be remarkable. Just a heads up that will be occurring at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So for Neil, it'll be 6 o'clock out in California in the morning, so that we can reach our audiences both here and in India. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks. Be well.
Exactly.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Bye-bye.